Okay, so thank you for joining me today for a little bit different episode of Ross Examination. And actually, the last episode of Ross Examination, I don't mean as in that I'm ending the podcast, but we're pivoting a little bit at this point. Anyone who listened to the last episode, you may have heard me mention. Essentially, we're taking a little bit of a break, and I say I've actually brought someone on to help out, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But I thought it might be interesting just to, in this mid-period, do a very quick 20-minute look into kind of what's gone on for the first 13 episodes and where it's going, and a little bit as to where we got it wrong, where we got it right, how it's actually been, some of the stats behind it, all of that sort of somewhat interesting part behind the podcast, and why we started to change it and why I started it in the first place. So the reason I started the podcast in the first place was I wanted something that I could use to get to know people around the world of performance, a little bit around wildlife, all those sorts of areas. And a podcast seemed the best way to do it. You could get really deep conversations, you could learn a little bit, get a little bit behind the scenes. And that's one reason I started it. Then there was the personal branding side of things as well. And I'd be lying, I think, with podcasts in general, a lot of it is quite self-indulgent in a way, but that's a good area to start if you want to develop that personal brand. And I think personal branding nowadays is such a powerful piece, even though I sometimes write pieces on LinkedIn and I write them myself and I'm like, I think people will assume this is ChatGPT now because of how good it's getting, but personal brand is that way to stay ahead of that. And so since doing this, I've gone a little bit of a journey. So started for that, and then as we got into it, I found it's a really enjoyable part of what I do. So I have the business around performance and culture and management, all those sorts of things, and everything I do for a podcast I quite enjoy. So it's become a little bit bigger as it's gone on. Now, if we go back to the start and the very first podcast, the first episode with Cam Whitnell. So before I did this, I thought about, okay, how do I want to approach starting a podcast? And my first thought was, okay, well, I want to have guests on that are really going to give me that hard and fast entry. I didn't want to start and for it to flop. I was really scared of that at the start. And I thought, okay, the first person I'll get will be Cam Whitnell from Wildlife. He's got a few things. He's got a really interesting story. He's got a fairly big following, and he'll hit one of those topics I really like, which is wildlife. So thought about getting Cam on, thought about getting a few other people on, and then sent out some messages. And I eventually got Cam in a studio on the right day, and we recorded. Now, that episode didn't actually come out for about 4 months. Well, I just didn't really know what to do with it. So the first thing to say is I thought I'd be quite efficient, film it, get it out in a couple of weeks. I mean, from filming the first one to his coming out was 4 months, and then the second one, which I recorded maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, to that one coming out was another 2 months. Actually, it was 3 months because my membership on my podcast distribution app sent me a little warning saying, you've only got 2 months left of the first free trial. And went, oh, how has that happened already? And we essentially, I thought, okay, I've really got to get on this now. So that's the first thing, is that it took a lot longer to get everything done. But I think it's interesting to start with the studio as well. Now, I thought when I first booked the studio, what am I really looking for here? I assume most studios, I'll have good sound, they'll have good equipment, all that sort of thing. And what I really wanted was the aesthetic. I wanted the look to be right. So I found this place above Chalk Farm Tube Station, and the look was really good. And it's the one you'll see if you look at any reels from the first couple of podcasts with Cam, with Joey, with Vince. They're all in that first studio. Since then, I've had, I think, 4 different studios since then, until we got to here now today, which is where I'll be doing it moving forward. But I wanted the look. What I didn't realise is actually sound isn't always that good. The visuals aren't always that good. The professionalism isn't always that good. But then also getting the recording itself and getting that on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all these things, was a lot harder than I thought it'd be. So the first one I did, it got sent to me. I had about 6 different audio files. Some were mixed, some weren't. I then had the camera angles. Initially it was one wide, and the close one was moving, and so there was a lot of editing that needed to be happened. I didn't realize that editing would be so long and costly. I just paid for the recording, so then I was left with all of this large massive files to then do something with, and went, how am I going to do this? So I went on Upwork, found someone to do that. Again, that took a long time to figure out the right quality. And this, if you go back and listen to Cam's one, Vince's one, and again Joey's, all three of them have been sort of pieced together, luckily by the person I've brought on, and they've come out okay. But if you listen to the quality of those first ones, they're actually quite low. I had some comments, especially on Vince's one, saying really interesting, but I just couldn't deal with the sound. And that was stuff I just didn't know. I went in a bit blind. I should have asked more people before I started, how do you do this in the best way? But from the tech side, that was really frustrating, because I thought if you were paying for a studio, you're probably going to get it all done. I didn't know what I didn't know. So I've now got to a point where I've got a studio which is super easy to use, not too expensive, and everything works. It's very much sit down, everything's done, then sent to you in a really easy way to then be edited. So that was a big thing at the start. And how much they actually cost. So I thought they can't be that much. Surely I can maybe even do this my own if I can get a camera and all this. I looked into the good cameras. Maybe they're about $1,000. You could just use an iPhone, but I wanted to do it properly. The camera's about $1,000. I thought, okay, maybe a studio is the way to go. Just that ease, that professionalism. I'm not that tech savvy, so I thought maybe better way to go down the professional route. So what do they actually cost? Well, the initial ones were costing me maybe 200 quid for the space, then another 150 to get it edited, and then a few other little things. It was costing quite a lot per episode. Now it's much less. It's about £130 total to get an episode done, and far better quality. So it took a little bit of trial and error to get to that point. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit was on getting the right guests. So when I started, I had those very 4 key areas. It was wildlife, it was performance, it was psychology, and I think it was business. Those are my 4 areas that I'm interested in, that I wanted to talk about. Now, what I didn't realize is I wanted to go down a slightly different route with it, and sort of halfway through, and I boxed myself into a few topics. So I had Alan Hertz on, who did an episode on London's history. I've had a few others that have lined up for the future as well that are slightly outside of that. And while some of these episodes really funnel directly into what I do as a business, others was purely out of interest. And finding the right guests is actually really hard. Finding people that are really interesting. So I actually had a test to show who I would have on the show, and that was, could I get caught up in a conversation with them for about an hour? If I could do that without even thinking, we'd probably have a good episode. Vince was one of those people. Joey, who came on, always like that. Ross Ducat, who I split into a 2-parter. So at this point right now, we've got 13 episodes out, I think, and 2 of them have been split into 2. So it's probably actually only 11 guests that I've had on. And then we've got a couple in the bank as well that'll be coming out soon. But of all of them, I can have a pretty easy conversation with those people. And that was a real tester. But I thought it would be easier to attract people on. It's not as easy as you'd think. And I think there's an element of, so many people have a podcast now, so standing out and having something a bit different was really hard. And my name for the podcast has been Ross Examination. So, of course, that was actually a working title at the start. Ross Examination, a pun on cross-examination, something to do with interviewing in my name. And then I just couldn't think of anything better. Now, moving forward, I'm actually going to be changing the name, and I'll come to that right at the end and explain why I've gone in that direction and what it's going to look like moving forward. But I just wanted to go through some of the other stuff that I've been experiencing throughout. So I definitely underestimated the amount of work that goes into producing a high-level podcast. So in order to get a podcast done, you first have to find a good guest, organise and get that guest to agree to come in at the right date to the right time. I said I wanted all of my episodes to be in person, so I've still not compromised that. I've actually travelled quite a bit to get some of these episodes, but I like them in person. I think the conversation's better. I think it flows more easily. But you have to get someone on the podcast the right date in the right spot, and that's hard as it is. Then once you do that, you have to get the files over. You have to download it, you have to edit it, you have to add your intros, your outros. We might even go for a little jingle moving forward just to have a nicer flow to start. Then you have to, from that point, from releasing it, you have to put it up on Buzzsprout, which is what I chose as my distribution. So you upload it all there, you add the thumbnail, you add the name, you add the description, and then it distributes it straight to all the podcast platforms. Once you've done that, you then need to do the promotion. Now, the promotion, best sort of avenues on that is short form content. So that would be YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, or whatever that is. So you have to actually create that content. Then that's another thing. So creating content means editing reels, taking out all the dead space. That was something I was very bad at the start, creating a hook right at the beginning. So in terms of getting that podcast out, there's quite a bit of work, and there are some bits there that I just wasn't very good at the start and tried to do it all myself. So that brings me to one of the big announcements around this is I had a few episodes from the start that were hanging around that were harder to edit. And one of my friends, called Sean Wise, who's been working with Box to Box Media, who do Drive to Survive and working on shows for them, said, you know what, I can help you out with an episode if you want, looking to get into the podcast space. And he helped me out. He edited the ones that I just didn't even want to touch. And it went really well. And I said to Sean, look, you're very good at this. I would love if you would come on board and help me out a little bit. You know, I'd be happy for you to get involved with the podcast, and if you can take care of the editing side. And he's also a very personable guy as well, so it'd be really helpful to have there on the day to make sure nothing goes wrong. And Sean said, okay. So bringing Sean in has been really useful for a lot of reasons, mainly taking care of the stuff that I'm just not good at, and actually having a different mind on the way we're doing things as well. So making me a little bit more organized with my questions and how are we going to do this, how are we going to do that, perhaps we could promote like this. Has been really useful. And moving forward, Sean's played quite a big role in reshaping that as well. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was the whole idea of starting a podcast and actually posting took me way too long. The main reason for that was I was probably a little bit worried about how it would look. You're trying to be a podcast, you're trying to do this, you're trying to build a following around these things and position yourself as this and that. That slightly bothered me at the start, and it made me take way longer than I needed to. And don't get me wrong, there are probably people out there that do think those things, but if they do, it will be a minor part of their day. And that's quite old hat to say now. Everyone knows that people care less about you than you think they do, but it still really held me back, even though I knew those facts. I knew no one cared, but it really stopped me. And I still have it a little bit now, posting online a podcast clip. Are you trying to be Joe Rogan? And that held me back quite a bit. I wish I'd sped that up and just gone for it a bit more. One of the other things I learned while doing this, so to go into this, what I really mean is like actually as the host, what did I get wrong? And one of the major things I got wrong was I was using the podcast at the start far too much as my platform. I wanted to talk too much. I'd tell stories, and the way I'd answer questions or ask questions were they would say something and I'd say something back as a statement because I wanted to show what I knew as opposed to getting them to elaborate. That seems quite simple, but I didn't really realize it till I heard it back and went, why am I talking so much in these? Like, the whole point is you get them on and then it can organically develop into a conversation. And I've still got that wrong. There's a couple that will be coming out soon where I still do it a little bit too much. And I'm constantly thinking, how can I do this better? And then the preparation side as well. There are some where I think you can over-prepare and then you make the conversation too rigid. And then if you under-prepare, you don't get good enough questions. So I found a good sweet spot for me where I have a good enough understanding of where I want the conversation to go with a few backup questions to, if things do go a bit silent, how can I get that conversation back up and running? So that's something that I'm by no means there, but I'm getting a little bit better at. Not saying, yeah, okay, yeah, while they're talking, because it's actually really distracting when you're listening. And then touching the mic, doing little things that are quite annoying when it comes to editing. Another great thing to have Sean for. So those are some things I've learned. Then I thought it'd be interesting as well to talk around the results for podcasts, because going into podcasting, I didn't know what the stats were. Like, what should you actually expect? So I'll give you mine first. So considering I've released 13 episodes, the best performing ones are getting between 100 and 200 listens, which to me sounds quite low. And then the lowest one got 28 listens. So 28 listens. That's the range, and everything else somewhere in between. So I felt, that's not really that many people. But I looked at the stats around podcasting and I saw that on Buzzsprout, they have data on, it's a big distribution platform. They have data on how many listens each episode gets. And they judge it a lot on the first 7 days. So you upload an episode, over the next 7 days, how many downloads does it get? And what I was fascinated to find out was to be in the top 1% of all podcasts, you need 4,500 downloads within the first 7 days. That's the top 1%. To be in the top 50%, so the top half of podcasts, you need 30 downloads. That's it, 30. So that showed me how much of a top-heavy industry podcasting is. You've basically got these top groups. I think the top 10% is something like 400 downloads in the first 7 days. And that, for me, when I was looking at it, I thought that's actually quite achievable. We've not been doing too much promotion at the moment. We've been doing maybe one short form video per episode, maybe an Instagram story, maybe a LinkedIn post. That's about it. And there's not been much consistency, and the podcasts have not been of that high quality yet in terms of the production value. The guests have been great, and my interviewing skills, my production skills, all of that needs to improve. So that's where we're getting to now, where it's starting to get a bit better. But looking at that, I thought, okay, it's actually not that hard to get into this sort of top 10%, and we're already in the top 50%. So those are the stats around it, which did shock me. And then it comes to the short form, because if you look at it now, the real honey trap for podcast listeners is going to be short form content. So one of the lowest performing podcasts I had was actually the one with Vince Walsh, because I barely did any promotion. Now, Vince spoke about some really interesting stuff around teams and the neuroscience of teams. He actually won't like that term, but
the neuroscience of marketing. There isn't one. There isn't one.
I thought it was one of the most interesting ones, and it wasn't doing very well. I put my first short up on, or reel up on Instagram from an episode with Cam Whitnell. It got something like just under 2,000 views, which was basically nothing. I kind of went, okay, didn't do too well there, and I thought it would do really well. The second reel I put up was of Vince, and that reel got 850k views. And I was like, how has this done that? I tested it on YouTube and LinkedIn as well, and it did nothing. And so it blew up. And then Vince's became the second most listened to podcast, because even though it got 850k views, maybe 150 people went from there and listened to it. So it's not high conversion rate, but it started to get a bit of awareness around it. And then a few others did quite well as well. And those are ones where people on Instagram, whatever, didn't collaborate. They just organically did well. So with the algorithm as it is now, it's very hard to predict how well you'll do, and it doesn't accumulate as you'd think. It's not like, okay, you do well, the next one's now going to do well, and it builds and you start to get a bit of favour. It's genuinely a bit of a lottery every time. So that's kind of some of the successes we've had from the social media world. There have been some big hits there. The average, I think, per reel has been around, I think it's like 11 or 12k views, which is good. But that's just kind of a high level overview. I want to talk very quickly now about where we're going with this. So the whole idea is we've been doing this kind of as we can in an amateur way, and now we're moving to how can we take this a bit more professional. So Sean's come on, that's been a fantastic start. How can we post more regularly? How can we get the good promotion out? If we're going to do it, you might as well do it properly. Doing it half-heartedly, it's fun, but it's not really going to achieve what I want it to achieve. And that brings me to the name as well. So I've decided to change the name. I'm going to be keeping the name Ross Examination for episodes where I do a deep dive on a certain topic. So it might be an area that I'm super interested in, that I want to do a deep dive on, a little bit like this episode where I go deep into one topic. And that will still be called a Ross Examination, because it probably fits a little bit better. Certainly, I don't know if you don't know me and you hear my podcast called Ross Examination, you might be like, why do I want to go on that? So we thought around a few names, and I like the whole idea of alchemy being you take something like lead and you transform it into gold through a little bit of mystical means. I quite like that idea. And the people that I've had on have all had an element of they've been fairly unexceptional and they have made something unbelievable from their life. And it's really impressive. And this idea of alchemy is there's something to it we're not quite sure of. And for me, that struck, and we were playing around with names. Nothing really landed. And we thought about the name Human Alchemy, i.e. the alchemy of the person, how they've gone from this to that and that journey to there. That's the name we felt described best the people we wanted to speak to. And so from moving forward, that's what it's going to be called from now on. It's going to be called Human Alchemy. And ideally, we're going to have amazing people on that have done amazing things with their lives. And we're going to look into the process of doing that and the performance element of that. How have they achieved that level of performance in whatever field it is that they're doing? So look, I'm going to end it there because I think you don't want to hear me talking about myself for too much and my podcast. But if you have been listening to any of the episodes, I really appreciate it. Any minute you've spent listening to me and a guest is really valuable, and it goes a long way. So hopefully moving forward, we can produce some really great episodes that are worthy of your commute time, or worthy of a plane, or wherever you decide to listen to it, or going on a walk. But keep an eye out for the episodes that to come, and I think they're going to be fantastic. I hope so, and hopefully you can come along for that ride. Have a fantastic day, and thanks for listening.